I read a fantastic article from a writer who I've been reading a lot more from, Cory Doctorow. Cory Doctorow probably now is most known for inventing the term enshittification. You've heard me talk about this a little bit, and honestly, a lot of the conversations that I've had about how digital play has been changing in the world of tabletop role-playing games, the concerns that I have about it, the mitigations that I think we can put in place, a lot of that is coming because I'm reading Cory Doctorow talking about how bad things have gotten with other forms of digital entertainment and digital tools that we have, and how bad it's gotten elsewhere. It isn't nearly that bad in our hobby, and I don't want it to become that way, which is why I talk about it so much. Anyway, I really love his articles, but he wrote an article about a week ago that I read, which is so relevant to tabletop role-playing games. It even mentions tabletop role-playing games in the article. The name of his article is called Against Lore. And it has some spoilers for Furiosa, the movie Furiosa that just came out. And he talks about that. I skipped that part because I didn't want to have spoilers for Furiosa. But I had a feeling I knew what his point was. And he starts off with a really fun anecdote. And the anecdote is that he had a Navy veteran that he talked to and had a lot of experience with like gun lore. And so whenever Cory Doctorow was writing a novel where he talked about a gun, and he would say like, I don't know if he actually had this as a problem, but he was, that people who are gun aficionados would read what he would say about a gun and say, well, that's totally not how that works, or that can't work that way, or this other thing doesn't work that way, or that they would get into the technical details of what other gun stuff he was talking about in his book and tell him how wrong he was. And so this guy said, here's a way that you can solve that problem. Every time you mention a particular type of gun, just add the word modified to the front of it. So if you say like, hey, she picks up her AR-15 and sprays a hail of bullets into a car door, you just say she used her modified AR-15. And the minute you put modified in there, gun nuts would look at that and say, oh, and their heads would go like the meme of all of the calculations and stuff like that. And they would fill in the blanks of how it was modified to be able to accomplish the thing that it did in whatever the book was. So all you would have to do is add the word modified to the beginning, and it let the reader fill in the blank of what modified meant with whatever they were going on. An example, and so he talks about how important this idea of leaving blanks in fiction is, to let the imagination of the reader fill it in with their own stuff, and how powerful that is. Now, in the world of tabletop role-playing games, we know this a lot. Anybody who's sat around with creative players knows that creative players are bringing as much as you're bringing to make your game really fun. And it's because there's a lot of blanks. There's a lot of times where people can add their own stuff into the game. And we talk about things like knives, the concept of knives. A knife in an RPG is when a player hands you something in their backstory that you can grab and use as like a moment of tension. And I've been using it like crazy in my Shadow Dark games, that when characters have bits of backstory that you can grab onto and use, they kind of call it a knife because it's like the player is handing you a knife and then you stab them with it. That's a little bit much. But like many times it's like you can grab elements of their backstory and use it as moments of tension, or use it as kind of ways to challenge the player and challenge the characters, not in a mean way, but in a fun, creative way. And we do that because we have these blanks that we don't know all the backgrounds of the characters, but the players do, and they bring us stuff. So that whole idea about leaving blanks in our game, I think, is so powerful. And we don't think about it. A lot of times we're just doing it. Cory Doctorow does talk about it in the realm of tabletop role-playing games. He has this whole section on tabletop role-playing games. He's mostly talking about here kind of about how game masters are denying the thing that players want through like victory and treasure, and how he's kind of loosely talking about beats, like story beats kind of, but I think he misses the mark on this, because there really are ways that we leave tons of blanks, and the blanks that we leave in role-playing games I think are far more wide and useful than they are even when we're doing it in fiction. But like another example of like how this manifests in fiction, and one element to it, which I think is vital, is that we don't try to fill in those blanks ourselves, particularly if we try to do it after the characters or after the players have filled it in with what they've filled it in with. Don't go back and try to fix it afterwards. I'll give an example of this, and this is going to be controversial, and I'm going to get comments on the YouTube, and I guess I'll just deal. Don't worry, we don't have to have a deep conversation about this or not. But the example would be Star Wars. For those of us of a certain age who grew up with the original Star Wars trilogy, New Hope, Empire Strikes Back, and Return of the Jedi, there were elements of lore that were put in those movies that were huge blanks. An example is the Clone Wars. It's mentioned, I think, one time. They mentioned the Clone Wars. Oh, you fought with my father during the Clone Wars. We didn't know anything about it. We didn't clone. Who were cloned? What clones? Clones? What's that? Right? No idea what's going on. We see things like Boba Fett, and we're like, who the hell's Boba Fett? Right? Where'd this guy come from? How's he so smart? Right? There's all of these blanks in the original trilogy. And we, for 20 years, again, those of us of a certain age, filled in those blanks with our own ideas. And there were comic books and there were novels and stuff that also kind of touched on it. And sometimes we liked those and sometimes we didn't. But a lot of times you're like, I don't know. I had my own idea about what the Clone Wars are. I had my own idea about who Boba Fett is, right? We had all these ideas that came from that lore because the lore had lots of blanks and we filled in those blanks with our own ideas. And then Lucas said, hey, I don't like your ideas. I'm going to make my ideas. And then he did Phantom Menace and Attack of the Clones and Revenge of the Sith. And he made his 3 movies. And many of us weren't real big fans of it. I weren't big fans of it for lots of reasons. But one of the reasons is we're like, all the clones are actually Boba Fett's dad? That's C-3PO was made by Darth Vader? That seems unlikely, right? And he filled in all of these blanks with stuff. And we're like, I don't like his, I liked mine. Now, what's interesting is you get other Star Wars fans of a certain age who really like the original movies, mostly because they were like 12 years old when they saw those movies. They hadn't spent 20 years filling in the blanks with their own stuff. There were no blanks. A lot of them saw the prequels before they saw the New Hope, which meant then they already had that stuff defined for them. There never was an opportunity to have those blanks, which is why that group likes those movies while other people, like mine of a certain age, don't like those movies. It's because where were the blanks left? Right, in these things. There are other blanks, like who the hell are the Sith? Where did they come from? What's the rule of 2? What, all these other elements that then are blank, and then they define those later. And then that, and that can cause problems in other ways. The point is that when you leave blanks, you don't want to shake them up by filling in those blanks after your players have filled them in. So there's lots of interesting areas where these blanks manifest. But again, we're talking about tabletop role-playing games. So where do we see these blanks in tabletop role-playing games? I have an article that I'm working on for this. I'm going to kind of talk it through. Just described all those things. But here are some interesting ways that we can leave blanks in our own role-playing games that really matter. So an example are monsters descriptions. I screwed this up last week. I left a blank and it was great. And then I'm like, I filled it in. And the example was I was describing that the characters were in this deep cave and they were fighting a creature that they kind of recognized as a drider. That was easy for them. Like, oh, it's a half human, half spider guy, but he was unique. And then I said, and he's that there's these creatures in the shadows, and they have like spider-like heads with black eyes that are blinking at you suspiciously, and clackers that are clacking together, and they're sending rhythmic clacks that you think maybe if you understood their language you could pick up bits of it, but you can't because nobody speaks that. No human. And long arms with claws that are like dripping liquid, and big distended bellies, and walking on their hind legs. They weren't like spiders. They were like half humanoid, half spider things with weird bulbous bodies and heads full of, and the players are like, God, what the hell are these things? And then I wrote down, I said, Ettercap. And they went, oh, it's an Ettercap. Right? And immediately their heads were filling in details about what these crazy looking humanoids, half spider, half humanoid, the handmaiden keepers of this drider creature, this cursed half spider being that they were working with. And then I ruined it by saying, oh yeah, it's an Ettercap, right? And so describe monsters, don't label monsters would be an example. Talk about the huge hulking form standing 10 feet tall, wielding an axe that looks like it's made out of a carriage door, right? Or a club that looks like it weighs 200 pounds, drool dripping down from his tusks, tattoos covering half of his face. And you're like, what the hell's that? It's so much better. An ogre. You're fighting an ogre. Now you're fighting an ogre. Right? Good example. Like that to me is a real strong one. Leave blanks in the descriptions of your monsters so the players can imagine other horrible things going on. Unknown rituals. Sometimes the characters go in an area and they see symbols and runes and they want to understand it. And it's like, whatever this ritual is, it is beyond your capabilities to understand what they were doing here. And then the players fill in the blanks. A ghoul slaughterhouse. I had this in my Empire of the Ghouls game where I didn't want to describe what the slaughterhouse of Vandacool was like. So I said, over there is the slaughterhouse of Vandacool. You don't want to go there. Don't go there. And the player's like, we don't want to go there. Right? And because whatever was in their head about what's going on in the slaughterhouse of the ghouls, that was enough. A villain's dark past. Sometimes we just say, they come from parts unknown, right? Where did this villain arise from? What drove them to come to this? The players can fill in the blanks. We don't have to spell out the motivation for our villains. We might even have a motivation in our mind. We don't have to give it to the players. Let them come up with their own motivation. History of the world. A lot of times you can just sort of describe things and let the players describe it. You could talk about the War of the Obsidian Blade. Right? You are veterans of the War of the Obsidian Blade. What was that? What do you think it was, right? And they go, I brought this one up to my wife and she immediately had like a 20-page backstory about the War of the Obsidian Blade. And I was like, see, you filled in the blank, right? The smoky rifts to lands unknown. Maybe there's a great cleft and you can see smoky tendrils coming out of it. What's down there? Who knows? Dungeons deep. You can see sinkholes that are carving deep into the earth and you can see the remnants of constructed shapes down there, like old masoned walls and things like that. Who built them and why and how did they get so far down? Who knows? You leave it. Brutal scars. You might describe a guard captain as having a big scar across her nose and lip. And where'd you get that? She goes, I don't want to talk about it. Right? Fill in that blank. Histories of magic items. Sometimes you get an ancient sword wielded by primeval knights that have primeval glyphs along the edge. Well, what happened there? Right? The inner working. This is one of my absolute favorites. The inner workings of diabolic machines, right? That you can do things like the weird smell of ozone, the sound of rushing water, heat vents that are blowing heat. My big favorite is describing machinery beyond the walls of a dungeon. And there's things moving back there that are enabling traps to operate. How do they work? Who knows? I'm not thinking about it, but the players know, there's counterweights and I hear water rushing. It's probably a water wheel and maybe that's generating something. You could have a blast of an arc of electricity and they go, what is that, right? You can describe these machines, the inner workings, without describing them. Blanks, man. The blanks are important. What are some other kinds of blanks? Blank spots on a map. You don't have to fill out the whole map. This is that whole points of light idea from 4th edition of let's have a map, but not fill out every hex. Not every hex needs to have something in it. That doesn't mean there isn't anything in the hex. It means that it hasn't been found yet. It hasn't been defined yet. Elements of history. There could be entire sections of history left blank where the history books just don't cover them. A dark age. What the dark age, because all of the books were burned. Some say there was once a library that held all the history, but the books were scattered and the library is burned. And now we don't know anything about this time, only that was a time of great darkness. Blank information behind factions, right? Who are these different groups? How do they operate? Maybe we don't know. Maybe there's mysteries. Maybe they have inner rings of stuff. And then what are some blanks that we can throw to the players to help them fill them in? Campfire tales, one of my favorites that, you can say whenever they're taking a long rest, not every time necessarily, but sometimes you can say, where does your mind wander off to while you're sitting around the campfire? Does it head back to the past? Is there an element from your past that your mind returns to? Or are you thinking about where you're going to be in the future? What is your character thinking about while you're resting for that night? Or what are you talking about with the other players? How do you describe your killing blow? Describe your killing blow is one of my favorite things. When they kill a monster, tell me about it. They get to fill in the blank. That's a really good one. Physical characteristic of monsters. Describe an interesting physical characteristic of this monster that you're fighting. You can use that to identify the monster when you're doing more tactical combat. And also the players get to think more about what this monster is like that makes it unique. And one of my personal favorites at the end of the game is 1 year later, where is your character? Where does your Let's jump 1 year in the future. Tell me about where your character is now. You do this at the end of a campaign. I love doing this. Wow. If you ever want to see players grab on and fill in blanks that you had no idea what they were going to do that at the end of a campaign. Ask them where their characters are 1 year later. Write it down. Keep it in your notes, because it's so nice to hear about where the characters went, and the players get to run so much stuff. Those are really good examples, in my opinion, about where blanks can fit into tabletop role-playing games and where they matter. The one thing I'd like you to walk away from this is the idea that you do not need to fill everything in, that you can leave lots of blanks in your own story, in the story you're telling, and leave it to the players to use their imaginations to fill in those blanks, because they're going to come up with really awesome stuff. Along with awesome stuff like Dwarven Forge tabletop backgrounds, exclusive adventures, dedicated Discord server to join the Lazy DMs community and helping support me and the work that I do, patrons also get access to the monthly Q&A. The monthly Q&A is a great way to ask any RPG-related question. I answer every question every Friday morning. I get my measuring cup full of coffee, and I sit and I answer those questions. Some of those questions make its way here onto the talk show. Other ones become the catalyst for other future articles or other videos that I shoot.